In the final weeks of 1967, a 30-year-old Navy Chief Warrant Officer named John Anthony Walker Jr. drove from his home in the Norfolk, Virginia area to Washington, D.C., and walked into the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street Northwest. According to his own later account, given during FBI debriefings and to journalist Pete Early for the 1988 book Family of Spies, he did not sneak in through a side door or pass a note to a low-level clerk. He walked through the front entrance in daylight and told the Soviet official who met with him that he wanted to sell classified United States Navy communications material. At that point, he was a Navy Communications Watch officer with access to the cryptographic keying material used to encode top-secret naval message traffic, the literal keys that would let anyone who possessed them read America's most sensitive naval communications. He was married, with 4 children, and drowning in debt from a failed bar venture in Charleston, South Carolina. That single visit opened what the Department of Defense and federal investigators would later call one of the most damaging espionage operations in American history, a conspiracy that would eventually pull in Walker's brother, his son, and his closest friend, span 17 years, compromise more than 1 million classified messages, and end only because the person who exposed it was his own ex-wife. If cases like this one interest you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover a new documented Cold War espionage case every week. John Anthony Walker Jr. was born on July 28, 1937, in Washington, D.C. His father worked for a period in marketing for Warner Brothers before alcoholism cost him his job and pushed the family toward bankruptcy. They relocated near relatives in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was, by most accounts, an unstable childhood. A bright boy who did well enough in school, but who grew up watching a father's failures at close range. By his late teens, Walker had drifted toward petty crime. On the night of May 27, 1955, 17 years old and a high school dropout, he and a friend carried out a string of burglaries in Pennsylvania. Facing prosecution, Walker enlisted in the United States Navy that same year, a common arrangement of the period in which a judge would allow a young offender to avoid prison by joining the military. It was, in effect, the origin point of everything that followed. The institution that gave John Walker a second chance is the one he would spend 2 decades betraying. Walker trained as a radioman and moved into submarine and fleet communications, a technical specialty that put him in direct contact with the Navy's cryptographic systems. He married Barbara Crowley in 1957, and the couple had 4 children together over the following years, among them Michael, Laura, and Cynthia. By the mid-1960s, Walker held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer and had responsibility for cryptographic key material, the physical custody of the key cards and key lists that made the Navy's encoding machines function. This access was, in retrospect, the single most consequential fact of his career. Cryptographic key material does not protect one message. It protects every message encoded under that key, for every ship and shore station using the same system, until the key is changed. A radioman with custody of Navy key lists held, in a very real sense, access to the confidentiality of the entire naval communications network. Outside the Navy, Walker's finances were in trouble. He had invested in a bar in Charleston that failed, leaving him with debts he later said he saw no legitimate way of clearing on a chief warrant officer's salary. His marriage, meanwhile, was already strained. Barbara Walker later testified that the relationship was marked by his infidelity, drinking, and periods of physical abuse, and that she had long suspected him of affairs, suspicions that, as it turned out, were accurate. Whatever the precise mixture of motives, financial desperation, restlessness, a taste for risk present since his teenage burglaries, Walker made the decision, in the closing days of 1967, to offer his access for sale. The Soviet embassy on 16th Street was, in the late 1960s, a routine subject of FBI physical and photographic surveillance, much as Soviet diplomatic and cultural facilities were monitored throughout the Cold War in Washington, New York, and San Francisco. A walk-in visit by an American citizen was not itself a crime, since the building was Soviet sovereign territory, but such a visit would ordinarily have drawn at least some FBI attention had it been observed. Walker's initial approach went undetected. He identified himself by his true name and Navy affiliation, and offered cryptographic keycard material for money. Following standard tradecraft for vetting an unverified walk-in, the Soviets treated him with some initial caution. A genuine American serviceman offering top-secret key material was an enormous prize, but it was also exactly the kind of offer a counterintelligence service might use as bait to identify a hostile officer. Walker was tested, evaluated, and accepted. He was assigned a KGB case officer and, as was standard practice for a high-value asset, was handled mostly through impersonal methods rather than face-to-face meetings. Dead drops, signal sites, and prearranged schedules meant to minimize the number of times he and his handler needed to be in the same place at the same time. In the spring of 1968, within roughly a year of his recruitment, Barbara Walker found a grocery bag in which her husband had hidden a stack of classified documents. Confronted, Walker admitted what he was doing, and, in what the record describes as a deliberate attempt to implicate her alongside him, brought her with him on a dead-drop run. From the beginning, his Soviet handlers had explicitly warned him never to tell his wife or any family member what he was doing. He ignored that warning almost immediately, and the seeds of his eventual exposure were planted before the operation was even a year old. Over the following years, the Soviets paid Walker several $1,000s a month for what he supplied, a level of income, by his own testimony, well beyond his Navy salary, which he used to pay off debts and later to help turn around the finances of his failing bar. What Walker was selling was not, from the Soviet perspective, a single secret, but a capability. The ongoing ability to read encrypted US Navy communications in close to real time, including as his access and his network expanded over the following years, operational orders, ship movements, and anti-submarine warfare doctrine. The technical significance of this is worth stating plainly. Military cryptographic systems of the period, including the mechanical and electromechanical cipher machines the Navy used, were considered secure not because the machine's basic design was secret, but because the specific key settings that configured them were closely guarded and changed on a regular schedule. Without the current key, intercepted ciphertext was effectively unbreakable in any operationally useful time frame. With the key, that same ciphertext became instantly readable. Walker was not handing over documents. He was handing over the literal means to convert years of intercepted American naval radio traffic into plain, readable text, and to keep doing so for as long as the flow of new key material continued. Walker's espionage might have remained a solitary operation. Instead, over the following decade, he built it into a small, self-sustaining network. His first target for expansion was a Navy friend, Senior Chief Petty Officer Jerry Whitworth, whom Walker had met years earlier when Whitworth was a student in a communications course Walker directed. By Walker's own later testimony at Whitworth's trial, he spent roughly 3 years quietly gauging Whitworth's attitudes before making an approach, describing the process as an effort to sound out whether his friend might be, in his words, a possible recruit in the spying business. Whitworth agreed in principle around 1973. He re-enlisted in the Navy that fall, took a posting at the Communications Relay Facility on Diego Garcia, and by the summer of 1975, around the time Walker retired from the Navy, was actively supplying material. Whitworth would go on to serve in a series of postings with access to highly sensitive communications, including aboard the USS Niagara Falls, the same ship Walker had once served on, and later as a communications watch officer supervising cryptographic technicians aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, from which he removed a substantial cache of documents shortly before his Navy retirement in 1983. Over roughly a decade of involvement, Whitworth received on the order of $300,000 to $400,000 for what he provided, a fraction of what the material would have cost the Soviet Union to obtain through technical penetration alone. Around 1980, Walker recruited his older brother, Arthur James Walker, a retired Navy lieutenant commander, then working as an engineer for a defense contractor, VSE Corporation, in Virginia Beach. Arthur was, by that point, in serious financial difficulty, and John reportedly used a recruitment tactic he later said he had learned from the KGB itself, offering an outsized sum of money for something relatively easy to obtain in order to dissolve a target's doubts and then keep him wanting more. Arthur's contribution to the ring was real, but limited compared to Whitworth's or John's own. Technical documents from his contractor position rather than cryptographic key material. The third recruit was John Walker's own son, Michael Lance Walker, born in November 1962, enlisted in the Navy in 1982, and was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz as a yeoman, a position that gave him routine access to a wide range of classified operational material. Beginning in the early 1980s, he began removing documents from the ship for his father to photograph and pass along. Walker also approached his youngest daughter, Laura, who had enlisted in the US Army and worked in a communications-related role. She refused her father's request that she supply classified material. Laura's military career ended not long afterward when she became pregnant. Her father offered to pay for an abortion, which she also refused, choosing instead to leave the service and raise her child. Her refusal to be recruited and her later willingness to confirm to investigators that the approach had happened would prove decisive to how the case finally came apart. By the mid-1970s, Walker's Soviet handlers had grown uneasy about the pace at which he was expanding the ring on his own initiative. At a face-to-face meeting in Casablanca in the summer of 1977, his Soviet contact reportedly reprimanded him for recruiting Whitworth without authorization. Walker agreed afterward to hold annual clandestine meetings in Vienna, and not to bring in further recruits without approval. He later claimed that during one of these Vienna meetings he was debriefed by a group that included the KGB chairman himself, a claim other researchers of the case have treated with skepticism. Barbara Walker's suspicions about her husband predated her formal knowledge of his espionage by years, and once she knew, she carried that knowledge for well over a decade before acting on it. According to her later trial testimony, she had, at points, participated at the margins of the operation herself. By her own account, she was responsible for straightening and ironing the tightly rolled bills the Soviets paid Walker in $50 and $100 denominations, and she accompanied him on at least one dead-drop trip to the Washington, D.C. area. She recalled one delivery that yielded roughly $35,000, a sum that struck her, and later struck investigators reviewing her account as implausibly large for what she believed was comparatively minor material, a hint of how much larger the true operation was than even she understood. The marriage, already marked by his infidelity and periods of abuse, ended in divorce in 1976. Even afterward, Barbara remained entangled in what she knew. By 1980, she had begun drinking heavily and had grown increasingly afraid for her children's safety and futures, wanting them kept out of her ex-husband's operation entirely. A fear that, in John's continued efforts to recruit Laura, was about to prove justified. Barbara tried, by her own later account, to contact the FBI's Boston field office on several occasions in the years that followed, but each time either hung up before connecting or was too intoxicated to get through. The specific push that finally moved her to follow through came, according to multiple accounts of the case, from two overlapping sources: her daughter Laura, who urged her to go to the authorities, and, according to later reporting, a custody dispute then underway between Laura and her estranged husband, which brought the question of the family's stability and John Walker's attempted recruitment of Laura back to the surface. On November 17, 1984, Barbara Walker telephoned the FBI's Boston office and said she had important information about her ex-husband. It would be nearly 2 weeks before the Bureau followed up in person. On November 29th, an agent from the Hyannis, Massachusetts resident agency interviewed her at her home. His written report noted that she appeared to have been drinking when she answered the door, and that she drank a large glass of vodka during the interview itself. He found her evasive about why she had waited so long to come forward, concluded her allegations were likely coloured by alcohol abuse and lingering resentment toward her ex-husband, and recommended no further action. The report was filed in Boston and for a period went nowhere. A second, unrelated thread was already sitting unresolved in the FBI's San Francisco field office. Beginning in May 1984, San Francisco had received a series of anonymous letters signed Rus, writing from somewhere, USA, confessing in general terms to years of participation in a Soviet espionage ring, and attempting, through several follow-up letters and even personal advertisements placed in the Los Angeles Times, to negotiate immunity in exchange for cooperation. The Department of Justice declined to negotiate immunity through anonymous mail correspondence, and after a final letter in August 1984, Rus went silent. The identity behind the letters, Jerry Whitworth, who had grown anxious about his own exposure after retiring from the Navy the year before, would not be established until months later, and only because the Walker investigation eventually converged with it. Because Barbara Walker's report concerned a person living in Virginia, the Boston office had forwarded her file to the FBI's Norfolk field office. When Norfolk's counterintelligence squad reviewed it, agents there took it more seriously than the initial Boston assessment had. On March 7, 1985, FBI agents interviewed Laura Walker Snyder, who confirmed that her father had approached her about supplying Army communications material and that she had refused. Both Barbara and Laura were re-interviewed, and both passed polygraph examinations. On March 12, 1985, FBI headquarters authorized a full field investigation, codenamed Windflyer, a reference to Walker's status as a licensed private pilot, and sought and received authorization under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act for electronic surveillance of John Walker. As the Windflyer investigation progressed through the spring of 1985, agents began cross-referencing details from Barbara's account, including her partial and initially uncertain recollection of a friend of her ex-husband's, whose name she remembered only as sounding something like Wentworth, against the still unsolved Orwell's letters out of San Francisco. The two threads pointed toward the same person, Jerry Whitworth. Surveillance teams kept Walker under close observation through the following weeks, watching his movements and monitoring his calls for evidence of an actual delivery that would let agents catch the operation in the act rather than relying solely on his ex-wife's and daughter's testimony. In one intercepted call, agents heard Walker mention an errand only he could perform, the kind of vague but suggestive phrase that, layered onto everything else investigators had gathered, told them a delivery might be imminent. Agents also learned Walker had told associates he intended to travel south to Charlotte, North Carolina, over the weekend of May 18th and 19th, 1985. On the afternoon of May 19th, 1985, Walker loaded several bags into his van and set out, not south toward Charlotte, as he had told people, but north, toward the Washington suburbs of Maryland. FBI agents, coordinating ground and air surveillance, tracked him through what investigators later described as an elaborately circuitous route, guided by written directions and annotated photographs his Soviet handlers had supplied, marking specific roadside sites where he was to leave a package and where he was to look for a signal. In this instance, a crushed soda can marked with coloured tape, left in advance by his Soviet contact to indicate whether the drop should proceed or be postponed. Walker's tradecraft that afternoon, honed across nearly 2 decades, involved a long sequence of stops and evasive manoeuvres meant to expose anyone following him, pulling to the shoulder, doubling back, driving through parking lots. Agents later noted he stopped more than 10 times over the course of the drive. Eventually, after passing his intended site several times, Walker parked on Partnership Road in Poolesville, Maryland, and left a crumpled paper bag at the base of a utility pole. Inside were roughly 127 pages of classified material that Michael Walker had removed from the Nimitz. The FBI recovered the package and, rather than moving immediately to arrest Walker, initially hoped to let the operation continue long enough to catch a Soviet handler retrieving it, which would provide unambiguous evidence for prosecution. Agents identified a Soviet embassy vice consul, Alexei Tkachenko, in the vicinity of the drop site in the days that followed, but the Soviets appeared to sense something was wrong and Tkachenko never approached the package. 3 days later, he and his family flew back to Moscow. With that opportunity closed off, and with Walker back in the area, the FBI moved to make the arrest. At around 3:30 a.m. on May 20th, 1985, agents, among them Robert Hunter and Jimmy Kalach, confronted Walker with weapons drawn in front of a hotel elevator near his room at a Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland. Walker drew his own weapon. The standoff ended, in Hunter's own later account, only after agents talked him into dropping it. A subsequent search of Walker's Norfolk home, conducted under warrant, produced records connected to years of payments and other material, consistent with the long-running operation Barbara and Laura had described. Walker's arrest set off a rapid sequence of further arrests as the FBI, working now from Walker's own files and the broader Windflyer investigation, moved against the rest of the ring. Arthur Walker was arrested by FBI agents in Norfolk within days of his brother's arrest. Advised of his right to remain silent and repeatedly urged by agents to wait for an attorney, he nonetheless kept making incriminating statements, apparently believing that visible cooperation might soften whatever came next. He ultimately gave interviewers some 35 hours of interviews, providing much of the evidentiary foundation later used to convict him. It did not spare him. On August 9, 1985, following a non-jury trial, Judge J. Calvert Clark, Jr. of the U.S. District Court in Norfolk found him guilty on all 7 counts of espionage. He was sentenced on November 12, 1985, to 3 concurrent life terms plus 40 years, a result that reportedly stunned even his own legal team, who had expected his degree of cooperation and the comparatively limited scope of his contribution to earn him a lighter outcome. Michael Walker was identified as a suspect while still an active duty sailor aboard the Nimitz, which brought the Naval Investigative Service into the case alongside the FBI. Investigators found a footlocker of classified material aboard the ship, and Michael was ultimately removed from the vessel under guard, reportedly to protect him from other sailors and Marines angry enough at the accusations to pose a physical threat. Jerry Whitworth turned himself in to authorities on June 3, 1985, roughly 2 weeks after John Walker's arrest, once it was clear the entire operation had been exposed. In late 1985, John Walker entered a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. In exchange for his guilty plea, a full and complete account of the entire operation's history and his testimony against Jerry Whitworth, prosecutors agreed to cap the sentence sought against Michael Walker at 25 years. John Walker was, in effect, buying a measure of leniency for his son with his own confession, a bargain that required him to acknowledge, in exhaustive and public detail, 17 years of betrayal that had already ended his marriage and was now shaping his children's futures as well. He was formally sentenced in 1986 to 2 life terms. He would have become eligible for parole in 2015. He did not live to see it, dying in prison of complications from throat cancer and diabetes. Michael Walker, under the terms of his father's plea, received the agreed 25-year sentence and was paroled after serving 15 years in February 2000. Jerry Whitworth, who did not plead guilty and instead went to trial in San Francisco, was convicted in May 1986 on 8 counts of espionage and received the harshest sentence of the 4, 365 years in prison, and a $10,000 fine, reflecting both the scale of his individual contribution, regarded by investigators as second only to Walker's own, and the fact that, unlike the Walkers, he offered the government nothing in exchange. Barbara Walker was never prosecuted, a decision that explicitly recognized the role her disclosure had played in exposing the ring, even though her own limited participation in its earliest years, the money the dead drop trip, was a matter of record. She later testified against Whitworth at his trial and told the court, according to that testimony, that had she known in advance that her son Michael was involved, she likely would never have made the call that exposed the ring at all, a statement that captures, as starkly as anything in the case record, the position her decision ultimately placed her in. The Department of Defense's damage assessment, publicly characterized by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, concluded that the Walker ring's compromise was severe and that the Soviet Union had made real, attributable gains in naval warfare capability from what Walker and his network provided. Insight into American submarine tactics, surface fleet movements, anti-submarine warfare doctrine, and the technical operation of American cryptographic systems themselves. Across the life of the operation, the ring is credited with compromising more than 1 million encrypted naval messages. Some assessments have extended the damage further back than the ring's core years, into Walker's Vietnam-era service aboard the USS Niagara Falls. Theodore Shackley, the CIA's Saigon station chief from 1968 to 1973, later stated that American forces frequently had advance warning worked against them, that B-52 strike targets were sometimes anticipated by the other side well before the aircraft arrived, an effect he and others have linked to the broader compromise of American communications during that period, though the exact contribution of Walker's material specifically is difficult to isolate with certainty. Historians and journalists who have examined the case since, most extensively Pete Early, drawing on extensive prison interviews with Walker himself, have generally concluded that the Walker ring represented one of the most damaging espionage operations in American counterintelligence history, distinguished less by sheer volume. Other Year of the Spy cases, like Jonathan Pollard's transfer of documents to Israel, moved considerably more raw paper, than by the specific character of what was compromised, not information about a single system or operation, but the sustained, ongoing means to defeat American naval cryptography across an entire theatre of potential conflict for the better part of 2 decades. The human toll extended, as it does in nearly every case of this kind, well beyond the 4 men convicted. Barbara Walker spent the years after the case carrying a public identity she'd not sought, the ex-wife who turned in the spy, an outcome she herself later suggested she might not have chosen, given the chance to do it over, once she understood it would also mean her son's imprisonment. Her decision to come forward is documented. Her later life is not well covered in the public record, and this account makes no claim about her fate beyond what is established, that her testimony and her daughter's were what finally broke the case open after years in which her own attempts to do so had gone nowhere. Michael Walker served roughly 15 years of his 25-year sentence before his 2000 parole, released into a world in which the Soviet Union he had once supplied information to no longer existed. He was in his late 30s by then, having spent the whole of his 20s and much of his 30s in federal prison for a conspiracy his own father had drawn him into as a young sailor. He later returned to Massachusetts, where his mother and sister Cynthia were living. Arthur Walker's life ended inside the federal prison system. He died at the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina on July 5, 2014, at age 79, having served nearly 3 decades of the life sentence handed down in 1985 without ever receiving the leniency his extensive cooperation had led him to expect. John Walker remained in federal custody for the rest of his life. He continued in later interviews to offer shifting and not entirely consistent explanations for his own motives. Financial pressure, certainly in the earliest years, but also, by his own admission, something closer to appetite, a taste for the double life itself and for the sense of importance it gave him. He died at Butner on August 28, 2014, at age 77, roughly 6 weeks after his brother in the same prison system, 2 brothers who had spied for the same foreign power, dying within weeks of each other in the custody of the country they had spent decades betraying. Jerry Whitworth remained in federal prison at Atwater, California, his 365-year sentence functionally equivalent to the remainder of his life. A judgment that of all 4 men, he, the trusted friend and former student Walker had recruited, deserved the least mercy, having offered the government neither Walker's guilty plea nor Arthur's extensive, if ultimately unrewarded, cooperation. The Walker case prompted an extensive reassessment of how cryptographic and personnel security actually functioned, as opposed to how it looked on paper. Investigators pointed to a series of institutional failures that let the operation run as long as it did. A system of periodic security reviews that was, in the 1960s and 1970s, considerably less rigorous than it became afterward. A documented tendency, visible in the Boston agent's initial dismissal of Barbara Walker's report, to discount tips from aggrieved family members as unreliable rather than treat them as a potentially critical source of insider knowledge, and a structural reliance on the presumed loyalty of cleared service members that was not matched by any real ongoing verification of that loyalty once a clearance had been granted. Separately, technical countermeasures developed in the years after Walker's exposure, including over-the-air rekeying systems that reduced reliance on physically distributed key material, were introduced specifically to close the category of vulnerability his case had exposed. The case also illustrates, with unusual clarity, the mechanics of Cold War human intelligence operations, the walk-in recruitment, the impersonal communication system built around dead drops and prearranged signal sites, designed to minimize direct contact between an asset and case officers who could be identified and expelled. The extraordinary lengths, the annotated maps, the crushed soda cans, the deliberately circuitous driving routes that both sides went to in order to detect or evade surveillance, and the way a single walk-in approach by one indebted, restless naval officer metastasized across nearly 2 decades into a family enterprise spanning 3 generations of a single household. What the case does not offer, and what neither the trial record nor Early's extensive interviews with Walker ever fully resolved, is a clean answer to the question of why. Walker's own explanations, offered across years of debriefing and later interviews, shifted without ever fully cohering. Financial desperation in the earliest years, when the failed Charleston bar had left him with debts he saw no other way to clear, but also something closer to appetite, a taste for the double life itself, for the sense of competence and importance that came from being treated by a foreign intelligence service as a uniquely valuable asset in a way his own naval career had stopped making him feel. He was throughout a father who used his position not only to betray his country, but to try to draw his own children into the same betrayal. A fact that separates the Walker case from a great many Cold War espionage prosecutions, in which the damage, however severe, was contained to a single person's choices rather than deliberately extended across a family. The Walker case resists the kind of clean moral accounting espionage stories are sometimes made to carry. John Walker was neither a committed ideologue betraying his country for a cause he believed in, nor a simple mercenary motivated by money alone, given how modest the ring's payments were measured against the scale of the damage they caused. He was, on the fullest record available, a man who found in espionage a form of validation his ordinary life had stopped providing, and who was willing, across nearly 2 decades, to convert that private need into other people's ruin. His brother gave investigators the evidence that helped convict him, and received, in return, the same sentence he might have received had he given nothing at all. His son inherited a conspiracy he had never chosen, and lost the whole of his 20s to it. His daughter refused the same recruitment her brother accepted, and, in refusing, became one of the 2 people whose account finally ended the operation. The FBI's own initial dismissal of her mother's first call is a reminder of how close that ending came to not happening at all. There is no version of this case that lets any of its participants be filed away simply as villain or victim. What the record does establish without ambiguity is the scope of the damage, and a family who spent the rest of their lives inside the wreckage of one man's decision in the last days of 1967 to walk through the front door of a foreign embassy and offer up the keys to everything he'd been trusted to protect,